Today we're covering everything you need to know about cold dark shells, what they are, why you would or wouldn't want to lease a space in this condition, and what your other space delivery options could be. And if you're interested in learning more about buying or leasing commercial real estate, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Each week we're releasing videos on investment strategies, leasing and management tips, market updates, and more. Leasing a commercial space can be compared to buying a classic car in some respects. The space may be move-in ready, but you'll likely have to do a little work and fine-tuning to get the space up and running. While you could spend the money and purchase a fully restored vehicle, some classic cars come without an engine, maybe missing an AC compressor, or could be completely empty except for the shell of the car, leaving some upside and cost savings on the table for anyone willing to put in the work. Sound a bit familiar to a specific type of commercial space? That's because it is. Here's everything you need to know about cold dark shells. Many tenants will run across a shell lease during their search for space. The term shell is also not universal, as a shell lease may be an entirely unfinished shell space, or it may have certain improvements that place it slightly beyond a shell lease classification. It can vary depending on the type of property and the ownership. However, you can expect a shell lease to have the structural components of the building completely intact, such as a roof, a floor slab or gravel, and exterior cladding to protect the space, hence why it's called a shell lease. So, what is a cold dark shell? Although there are variations of the cold dark shell, let's dive a bit deeper into the one that's ideal if you're looking to customize the entirety of a space, starting with the bare bones. Many businesses like the idea of customizing their space from scratch because it can improve their workflow and efficiencies above and beyond what a second generation space would offer them. Wouldn't you like a space that allows you to pour your creativity and the essence of your business into every component of the interior, down to the location of the light fixtures and the trim? A cold dark shell is, well, cold and dark. It refers to a commercial space without plumbing, elevators, HVAC, and electrical. It's essentially the skeleton of a space. So why would tenants want to lease cold dark shells other than being able to do their own build out? Well, building out a commercial space from a cold dark shell sounds like quite a bit of work. So why would you want to do that? As I mentioned earlier, a cold dark shell gives the tenant a greater range when it comes to the improvements and customization. The tenant has the liberty of deciding where they would like to place their bathrooms, how their ducting system will be designed, which interior finishes and selections to use, and so much more. If an owner makes the improvements themselves, they will likely finish the space out to building standard finishes, which may not necessarily be up to spec for the tenant. The costs are also very different from a second generation space. Cold dark shells are typically offered at lower rates than fully finished suites due to the upfront costs of improvements that the tenant must provide to get the space ready for business. Tenants may be able to recover some of their initial cost through a combination of the lower rent rate and tax write-offs from the space improvements, but tenants also aren't always responsible for paying for 100% of the costs involved in the new build out. Completely renovating a space can be quite costly, which can make it very difficult for a landlord to lease that space, which is why they'll often offer tenant improvement allowances, also known as TI or TIA. Tenant improvements are funds paid to the lessee by the landlord after the build out has been completed in order to help with the build out. Think of it as a refund for improving the landlord's building. Depending on the lease agreement, an owner delivering a space as a cold dark shell may offer TIA to offset the costs of improvements to the tenants and make the lease more attractive. So why do landlords deliver commercial space in cold dark shell condition? Well, there are multiple reasons, but mostly financing, flexibility, and curb appeal. The lower the cost of the building is to the owner, the less financing the owner will incur. Of course, they'll be incurring these expenses at some point, but by not drawing on those funds before having set plans for the space, property owners won't be incurring any interest carry involved with the loan. Not having the space built out already also gives the landlord flexibility as to which kinds of businesses they can allow to occupy the space. Whether the tenant needs an open floor plan or a number of private offices, the space can be built out to suit their needs. Another benefit is that the construction will not be wasted. A tenant is going to add the amenities and features they need, whereas the tenant may find that they don't need certain amenities and features of the space if it had undergone improvements by the landlord landlord prior to their lease. So think about it this way. Most of these spaces have poured concrete floors that are either finished and exposed or covered by some sort of flooring. If a dentist came along and needed a significant amount of plumbing and gas lines in the floor, they'd have to tear up quite a bit of that concrete to do so, which would incur expenses that they wouldn't have otherwise had. But there are also negatives of a shell space. These delivery conditions are far from perfect for some tenants too, and dark shells do come with a few drawbacks. A building without lighting and HVAC can be unattractive for some companies because of the additional time requirements and expenses that can be incurred. Thus, you typically don't find cold dark shells outside of prime locations in your city. Also, the more improvements a tenant must make on a space, the further along the tenant's move-in day will be pushed along. Most of these improvements cannot be made quickly, which can lead to a delay in the tenant's grand opening. But there is a solution. There are also warm shells. Cold dark shells aren't for everyone, so you do have other delivery options. The next step up is called a warm shell, which is sometimes referred to as a warm vanilla box. These spaces have typically been occupied by a previous tenant and have been prepared by the landlord for a newer incoming business. As you'd imagine, this type of space is outfitted already with electrical, plumbing, HVAC, which is why it's referred to as a warm shell, as it had undergone the build-out process to make it rentable. Just as the definition of the cold dark shell is not precise, a warm shell could lack certain amenities that other warm shells have. It just depends on the owner's definition of a warm shell. You can also expect shorter build-out periods since there will be less improvements to be made. But cold dark shells and warm shells are also not your only delivery conditions. There are a couple others. Cold dark shells and warm vanilla boxes, those phrases can actually be broken down to better understand what type of delivery condition is being referred to by the broker or landlord. You could have a warm dark shell, whereas the space has HVAC but no lighting, or a cold vanilla shell, where the walls, flooring, and fixtures have been prepared for the incoming tenant's build-out, but there aren't any mechanical systems. So let's talk about warm versus cold dark shells. Well, warm shells are significantly easier to deal with since they're a lower maintenance alternative and allow you to move on a quicker timeline. But there are reasons you wouldn't want a warm shell. It's certainly less work and less money that you'll have to deal with on the front end, but the tenant with a warm shell will likely be paying a higher price per square foot on the rent than the tenant that chooses a cold dark shell. Naturally, you'll pay less in build-out costs than a tenant with a cold dark shell would, so the landlord captures their cost of delivering the space as a warm shell through this rent rate as well. Now, here are the benefits of a cold dark shell. With this delivery condition, you have fully custom-built space, lower rental rate, and more finish options during build-out. Here are the benefits of warm shells. With warm shells, you have a lower build-out cost, shorter build-out period, if any, and less work on the front end. So which one should you choose? If you're ready to move in and open for business as soon as possible and don't want to endure the costs and the process of a longer build out, a warm shell is right up your alley. It allows you to move quickly and worry far less about space plans, construction, and reimbursements. However, if you're ready to build out your space from the ground up, want more options during build out, and don't mind the cash expenditure up front to get your space in perfect condition for your business, then you should take a look at spaces delivered as a cold dark shell. So that's it for everything you need to know about cold dark shells. Subscribe to the channel for more videos on investment strategies, leasing and management tips, market updates, and more, and we'll see you next week.